What is up, everybody? We are live here. This is Dr. Sam Watkins from MoveMend, and welcome to the MoveMend Physio Coaching Community, helping to empower ACLers throughout their rehab journey so they can have a good outcome and confidently return to the sports that they love. And today, the topic at hand is going to be strength in the early phase of ACL rehab. This is a super common one we chat about with both our clients are coming in for ACL rehab and one that we just get from people across the board. I think there's a lot of question marks about what kind of strength training you should be doing, what kind of strength training is safe, how am I going to make sure I have the best outcomes. And on one hand, I'm really glad that that strength is on the forefront of people's minds throughout this process, because the reality is that, in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons people are having re-tears and that the re-tear rate is so freaking high is because people aren't building the strength that they need to appropriately return to sport, right? The re-tear rate is about 1 in 3, depending on the study that you look at. And not even half the people that are returning to sport are passing the basic strength tests required to that demonstrate readiness to return to sport. Lots of reasons for this. There's tons of reasons. Is it that people don't know what they're supposed to be doing? Is it that PTs aren't appropriately doing the tests? Is it because the rehab just takes longer than people think it will, and they feel pretty good and are jumping back into things when they're not actually ready? I think it's all of the above, but the reason we put this community together and are providing you with access to these streams and have to put this roadmap together is so that you know what the standard of care should be, and the standard of care should include appropriate strength testing. And the only way that you're going to pass these appropriate strength tests is by having a good plan in place to develop the strength you need over a long period of time. And the early stage is where you build that foundation, right? We talk about this a ton. If you look at some of our previous live streams, early stage is about building the foundation, focusing on range of motion initially, but we start to build in strength work early on as well. And getting your muscles ready and starting to build some strength in this early stage is huge to the long term. So before we jump into some of the nitty gritty here, I want to disclose as usual that this is not medical advice, right? I don't know your exact situation, different procedure. Everyone has had a different procedure done, even if it's just slightly different. You've got to follow your precautions from your surgeon. And before you take any of the recommendations I provide here, check in with your surgeon, check in with your physical therapist. If you don't have a physical therapist that's helping you through this, reach out and schedule a consult, and we can get you on a program. But this is not specific to every single person. This is more just giving you a general framework of how I like to look at building strength in the early stages of ACL rehab. So let's jump into a couple of terminology points, just so we're making sure we're speaking the same language, everything's all clear. I'm going to be using words like atrophy, which is muscle loss. We see a ton of muscle loss after an ACL surgery. In particular, the quads and secondarily the hamstrings are hugely impacted by the trauma of surgery and also potentially the trauma of the injury, depending on what kind of prehab you've had. Ideally, you've had some prehab before going into your surgery so that you have regained the majority of your strength and muscle mass. But regardless, there's going to be quite a bit of atrophy, muscle loss after surgery, which is what we are trying to reverse for a good 9 to 12 months after surgery. Building that kind of strength back up after a trauma takes a long time. The other term I'm going to be using is hypertrophy, which is muscle growth. So atrophy is muscle loss, hypertrophy muscle growth. And this stream is focused specifically on strength, improving strength gains and muscle mass in the early stage of rehab. And when I say early stage, it kind of varies, but usually I look at that from day 1 after surgery to about the time when people are passing the tests and the criteria to return to jogging. And if you look at the roadmap, there's a pretty clear section in there with a list of tests that we like to make sure people can pass that indicates that they're ready to do some jogging. And that is the rough transition point between early phase and mid phase. I don't like to have these strict criteria about what exactly needs to be done in each phase, and they kind of do blend together. That is the reality of this situation. But things at month 2 are going to look much different. That is like the pure early stage to month 5 or 6 or 7. Talking about early stage here. This doesn't necessarily apply to later stages as well. So let's jump into some of the ideas here, and hopefully you can gain some information on how you can appropriately target building strength and targeting hypertrophy in the early stages of your rehab. So when we have surgery, like I mentioned, the trauma from going into the knee, digging tunnels, plugging a graft in that replaces your old ACL is significant. It really is. I mean, they're literally putting tools into your knee, drilling in, plugging those holes. And when we have trauma like this, there is significant swelling, and our body has mechanisms in place that are going to, by design, limit how well we can contract our muscles. And I think this is a protective mechanism our body has, right? If you have an acute injury, right, like an ankle sprain, for example, we've developed this mechanism so that if you roll your ankle really, really badly and it's super painful, you aren't going to constantly be using it right away, so you can let it rest. And while this mechanism can be helpful, right, it is also one of the big reasons for so much muscle atrophy after a trauma like surgery, right? So if you've had your ACL surgery done, you might have already experienced that weird feeling of not being able to turn your quad on after surgery. And this can last for a while, right? We just lose that connection. And that's that mechanism, that protective mechanism. But when we're not getting good input to the nerves of our quad and other muscles, we are going to see rapid atrophy. So that's one of the main mechanisms of muscle loss after a surgery like this. And the other one is just disuse, right? If we're not using our muscles in general, if someone is on absolute bed rest, there's studies looking at this. There's a lot of studies looking at astronauts who are not using their muscles in the same way as well. But if people are laying in bed all day, we're losing significant muscle mass on a weekly basis. I've seen some studies that point to up to 10% of muscle mass is lost in about a week of total disuse, right? That's people just laying in bed in these studies, not getting up, not turning on their muscles much because they're just laying around. So nerve inhibition to the muscles after surgery and after trauma and disuse are the main 2 drivers of muscle loss. And that kind of puts us in a little bit of a hole with muscle mass and strength after surgery. And building that back up takes time and effort. And so how can you make sure that you are not prolonging your rehab process, that you're setting yourself up for success in the long term with returning to sport by doing the right things in the early stages of rehab? So instead of just listing off a bunch of exercises that I would do, I'm going to mention those, but I want you all to have a framework for how you can apply some of these exercises to your situation, to work with your PT, and understand the process behind strength training in the early stages of rehab. And I put that in quotes because it's not going to look like traditional strength training. That's just, it just isn't, right? You have a super sore knee at week 3, week 4, and regardless of the surgical protocol, we're not going to be putting a heavy bar on your back and telling you to squat, right? The surgical protocol definitely wouldn't recommend that. I've not seen one that says at month 1 you should be doing heavy back squats, and that just is out of an abundance of caution for that immature and new ACL that they've put in your knee. But everything is going to be driven by the amount of stress that you can tolerate, right? All of these exercises, every exercise you do is going to be some stress on your knee, right? And if you have had a recent surgery, the amount of stress that your knee can handle is obviously much less than what your knee can handle if you have not had surgery. So because of that, I say strength training exercises, because you're not going to be putting a barbell on your back and squatting heavy at month 1 or week 4. It's just your knee's not going to handle it, and we're not going to actually load appropriately to target your muscles well to build strength. So people are often like, oh man, I'm a month in, I'm just doing these little exercises here, I'm getting a good burn, but when do I get to start lifting heavy? And the answer really is when your knee can handle it, along with the surgical protocol, and factoring in what positions and movements put more stress on the ACL and less stress, but that's for your physical therapist to recommend. But exercises are not going to look like what you might have envisioned a rehab will look like, and you'll get there. You should be putting a bar on your back at some point. You should be lifting some heavy weights, but yeah, I say strength training exercises because they don't look like like traditional ones, but that's by design. Honestly, that's really how it should be. So let's see if this is even legible here. My handwriting is very similar to my 4th grade handwriting. I've come across some of my old papers in my mom's house from elementary school, and it looks the same. So what I've written out here, which hopefully you can read, is a very brief outline of the mechanisms of strength and hypertrophy training. So is that going to be backwards for you guys? No, that should be good. The 3 mechanisms for improving strength and muscle mass hypertrophy are going to be neuromuscular mechanisms. So that's going to be your nervous systems, your brain's ability to connect to the muscles well and fire strongly. That's number 1. Number 2 is going to be metabolite accumulation. And so that's going to be when we exercise and we're overloading what our muscles can do, we feel a burn. We feel a burn because our muscles are being overly taxed to where they can't efficiently push out all of the accumulation of different cellular substances that then result in that feeling of kind of a burn, right? So if you've done a wall sit, if you've done a really long run, if you're running, you're breathing heavy, that's because your system's being overworked. And if your legs start to feel a little bit burny, that is that accumulation of metabolites, these chemical substances that results in that kind of burn feeling, or a pump, right? If you've been in the gym and done a bunch of bicep curls and your arms feel huge and juicy, that is that pump. So that's metabolic accumulation. That's number 2. And number 3 is mechanical tension. And so mechanical tension is every time we contract our muscles, there is a pull of our muscles, right? Biceps, I curl my arm, my bicep contracts, and there's a pull on that muscle, right? If I'm doing that against no weight except for gravity, which is not much, the tension on that muscle is not very big, right? But the more load we put on that tissue and that muscle, the more tension and pull on that tendon and muscle unit, it results in small amounts of damage to the muscle that then we give time to repair. And over time, we build more muscle mass and can produce more force and lift more weight. So there's the three main mechanisms: neuromuscular mechanisms, metabolite accumulation, and mechanical tension. And you don't need to memorize those, but I just want to give you a framework for why we're doing what we're doing and how different exercises in this phase will target some of those different things. So those are the three main mechanisms, but all of this is going to be shadowed by what your knee can tolerate, right? It's all going to be guided more so by how much stress your knee can handle, and even if and so mechanical tension, we'll talk more about this later in a little bit, right? Lifting heavier weight, focusing more on pushing more weight to put more tension into that muscle is going to come a little bit later in the early stage, because your knee can't handle putting a lot of load on the muscles around the knee yet. And so we focus on the other two because we can do that without as much stress on the knee, right? It's all about stress on the knee. If we overload the knee, we then need to scale back, and we can't actually push any of these mechanisms to the same degree if we overdo it for one session. So all about staying within the tolerance of your knee. So let's break down the emphasis of each of these mechanisms in the early stage. So the first two mechanisms, those neuromuscular adaptations and the metabolite accumulation, those are going to be the emphasis earlier on in rehab, right? So early on in rehab, a big focus is on working on your range of motion, getting those tissues at the knee lengthened so we're not developing excessive scar tissue and having issues on the line with a knee that doesn't fully bend or fully straighten, which can cause a whole set of issues. So that kind of takes precedence early on, but there still should be an emphasis on building some strength, promoting hypertrophy and muscle mass. And that's going to be targeting these first two mechanisms, that neuromuscular component and the metabolite accumulation. So let's think about the neuromuscular adaptations first. So that's going to be things like quad activation, right? Day one, or even post-op in the 2-week gap that surgeons often have between surgery and their people's first PT session. People are oftentimes given a handout that says do 100 quad squeezes a day. And after rehab, you might have found, or after surgery, you might have found that you can't get that same squeeze you can get on your other side, where it just feels so natural and easy on the other side, right? So that quad squeeze that you're doing is an exercise focusing on neuromuscular adaptations, just kind of rebuilding that connection between the nerves and your brain. So early on, like week 1, week 2, week 3, neuromuscular adaptations are key, and things like quad sets, things like banded terminal knee extensions. That's the one where that you'll see on the roadmap, where you are standing and have a band placed in front of your knee, and then you loop it under your foot and have the band behind your knee, and you're pushing your leg back actively, with your foot on the ground. You're standing. You're trying to straighten your knee into that band, right? And that's your quad squeezing to push your knee back, and having that little extra feedback from the band to push into is a nice cue to fire that quad strongly. It's a little bit of a step up from the quad set because there's a little bit of resistance. And I really like this one for people more than quad sets, honestly, just because it's so hard to find that like engagement. But if you have that little bit of resistance, people can oftentimes get a better squeeze. So like early on, these are things I hammer in. I'm like, I tell people, you're doing 3, 4, 5 sets of 10 reps of these terminal knee extensions with 10-second holds for each one. And it takes a while, but if you felt that kind of dead quad feeling where you can't activate it, it just takes a while for your brain to reconnect and fire that quad strongly, which is going to be huge for the later stages of even the early stage, where we actually need to start loading the muscle. And if you can't activate it very well in those positions, you're going to find ways to avoid pushing that muscle if we actually load you up. Yeah. Another exercise I like for more of those neuromuscular adaptations is going to be isos, right? So that quad set is an isometric, right? You're not actually moving your leg, you're just contracting it without any movement from the joint, right? So an isometric would be where I'm not, if I'm doing a bicep curl, where I'm pushing here, but I'm blocking my hand. So I'm just engaging without, unlike a curl with a dumbbell. That terminal knee extension, if you're holding at that end range, squeezing that quad, also is kind of an asymmetric if you're holding there. But one exercise that I think is crucial and underused in the early stages are about 70 degree knee extension isometrics on a knee extension machine. So it's not, you're not going to be kicking with a bunch of weight early on. You're going to get the knee extension machine set up where your knee is at about a 70 degree knee bend where there is no stress on the ACL. So right around that 70 degree mark, there's zero strain on the ACL. So you can pin that knee extension machine weight at the very bottom. Set it to a weight that you couldn't move if you tried it. And that you can use as a stationary platform to be able to push into it. And so what I like to have people do, especially after week 1 and 2, when the knee is a little bit more settled down, maybe even a little later than that, depending on how far out you are, is get people set up in that position, that 70 degree isometric position, load up the weight stack so you can't move it, and have people do up to 5 rounds of up to 45-second pushes where you're pushing as hard as you can without stressing the knee, without too much pain. A little bit of pain, a 1 or something like that out of 10. 0 is no pain and 10 is, oh my, I need to go to the emergency room right now. Pushing up to that 1, something that's not going to flare up your knee. If we can get to that point of pushing decently hard, you should feel like you're getting a good burn by the end, especially after 5 rounds. That is how we're going to really build that neuromuscular connection. Like strong contractions for a long period of time, and that it just feels much more natural to push into something than it does to try to just squeeze your quad without any load. So I have people do that one. I recommend it almost every day for people on top of the TKEs and band and knee extensions and things like that to really drive home those neuromuscular changes. So early stage, again, neuromuscular adaptations is one of the goals. And then number 2 is that metabolite accumulation, that pump, that burn. And that isometric exercise is a great example. Excuse me, clear my throat here. That isometric exercise I mentioned, that isometric knee extension, is a great example of one that does both the focus on neuromuscular changes as well as that metabolite accumulation, right? So if you do these isometrics and your knee is pretty settled and you're able to do your 5 rounds of 45 seconds, you're able to push as hard as you can, I can guarantee you by that 5th round, especially if you give yourself a good break between, a nice like 2-minute break between the sets, you will find that your quad is burning. Your quad is cooked by the end. You're feeling like you're at the end of a wall sit where maybe you're getting the shakes going, which is more of like a neuromuscular fatigue. But that burn that you get, like if you did a wall sit or if you go and walk up a steep hill for a long hike, that burn, that pump feeling is that metabolite accumulation. So we want to really try to lean into that. That's going to promote muscle growth and also twofold that neuromuscular adaptation. So isometrics, long holds in comfortable positions. It might even be a wall sit at month 1. Maybe not super deep, not maybe only to 90, if that. Long hold, so that big burn is huge. So the other way I really like to target that metabolite accumulation early on is with blood flow restriction training. And there's some information on that in the roadmap for you guys. But I think blood flow restriction training is an amazing tool, especially in the early stages, to actually load the quads, load the hamstrings with minimal stress. And the idea with blood flow restriction training, if you haven't checked that out or aren't familiar, is that you wear a medical grade cuff on your thigh that limits the amount of blood flow that we're getting during exercise. And in doing that, we're limiting oxygen supply, which is a main fuel for our muscles. And by doing that, we're able to use much lighter weights to still stimulate the same metabolite accumulation mechanisms to drive gains in strength. So blood flow restriction training is huge in ACL rehab. We have our own set of cuffs here that are medical grade, and so I have people come in on a regular basis to get that as much as they can. Sometimes people come in if they're part of our open gym setup multiple days a week, 5 days a week, 3, 4, 5 days a week to get that in on top of what they can do at home. And because we can use much lighter weight, right? Something like early on, even like an unweighted extension, just sitting and kicking your leg up nice and slow with the cuff on, will end up being a huge burn and a huge pump that you couldn't really get early on if you were trying to do it without the cuff, because you would need more weight, which is likely more than what your knee can handle. And again, if you push more than what your knee can handle, you're going to be sore, stiff, aggravated for the next however many days, which means those are days that we can't actually productively work and build. So early on, in the early stage, from weeks 1 through weeks probably around 8, so 2 months in or so, the main focus is on those 2 mechanisms of hypertrophy. So neuromuscular adaptation, metabolite accumulation. Around month 2-ish, there's more of a shift towards that mechanical tension, right? So load on the muscles, putting more load, so your muscles have to contract more and put more tension on them, which leans into that muscle damage, micro damage, right? Which is what causes muscle soreness and results in repair and increases in muscle mass and strength. Early on, we're not focusing on that part too much, because the amount of load it would take to actually put significant tension on the muscles is going to be likely too much stress for the knee to be able to give it the 5-day-a-week input we want to get that quad really firing well. But we transition as the knee tolerates more to focusing more on mechanical tension. And that's because as we lean more into mechanical tension, we are going to also be getting the metabolite accumulation and neuromuscular change. So a couple months in, the knee's more settled. What kind of things are we going to be working on? One that I really like to focus on is going to be a step-up movement. Right? Step-ups, forward movements with a pretty small box to begin with, maybe 4 inches, maybe 6 inches, not going into an 18-inch box right away, is one way we can start to put some more load into the muscles. By month 2, month 3, you're probably going to find that body weight squats where your weight is split, unless you're going to do 1,000,000 reps, is not really enough to actually get that fatigue stimulus. So we can increase that fatigue stimulus, increase the load on those muscles with a tolerable movement, a comfortable movement, like a step up, which is going to be pretty comfortable for the knee, usually at this point. And as the control gets better, as it gets easy, we can increase the height a little bit and also progressively add more load, holding on to something for balance if we need to really focus on driving through that leg with some good control, getting more load and tension on the muscles. And it generally is a pretty comfortable, tolerable exercise as long as you start at the right level. Things like knee extensions. The knee extension machine is going to be your friend for the long term, in my opinion. A lot of people don't want to harp on this too much, because I could talk for a whole session about knee extensions. But knee extensions, in my opinion, are huge throughout the rehab process. And people say it's not functional. Well, function is building up your strength. And if we aren't targeting our quad in a really isolated way, we're not going to be targeting our quad in a way that's going to really drive those same adaptations and strength, because we can't put the same stimulus in the quad with other exercises as we can with an isolated knee extension. So don't want to harp on that too much, but knee extension is a great example of that mechanical tension stimulus, right? Usually I don't really like loading people up in the knee extension through a full range of motion until about month 3 or so. But at that point, we're trying to target load and weight and mechanical tension, so we can really drive that stimulus into the quads and build the strength there. Same thing for hamstring curls. Unless you've got a hamstring graft, hamstring curls can be done a bit earlier and a bit more tolerated. But just in general, around that 2-month mark, we shift from only focusing on like isometric focus exercises for main fatigue, blood flow restriction with low load, to trying to focus on load into those tissues to drive changes in strength. At this point, it still is relatively early in the rehab process. Step ups probably aren't what people think of when they think of strength training. And so month 2 still probably isn't going to be a time when you're putting a heavy barbell on your back. Month 3 probably still isn't going to be a time when you're putting a heavy barbell on your back to drive strength, because your knee isn't going to tolerate high loads to those big ranges of motion. So some of these exercises like step ups and some step down movements, some split squat variations are going to be what I would recommend leading into, along with some more isolated exercises like the knee extension, hamstring curl, glute work, which should be done earlier as well. But thinking about the load as well, like I said, mechanical tension is about load, but we still need to be taking into account how much stress your knee can handle, right? And I like to think about using what I call sensible loads, right? We're doing a super intense 5-rep max, and that's not because it's not the ACL can't tolerate it with certain exercises, because again, there are certain positions where the ACL is under very minimal stress. It's more because of the potential backlash of the knee and those tissues, right? If you've ever done a super, super heavy squat for 5 reps, where you do 5 reps and you literally could not do one more rep, where if you went down, you're not coming back up, there's just so many question marks about how your knee is going to handle that. And if this is the threshold for what's going to cause irritation, if you're pushing to that point of your 5-rep max, you could so easily on that last rep take it way above here. And if we're going to aggravate things, if things are going to be overly sensitive and we're going to stress things too much, I want to make sure it's just there. And it's much easier to dial that in with a sensible load, something like in the 10 to 15 rep range than a 5-rep max. So even though we're leaning into mechanical tension, the rep range is still going to be higher, right? You're not training like a power lifter doing a heavy 3-rep squat. We are focusing on putting load into the tissues, but a sensible load, 10 to 15 reps, where you are still feeling like you're fatigued, still feeling like you're 2, 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure even. By failure, I mean like you couldn't get another rep out. Right? If you're about 3, 4, 5 reps from failure, you're going to still see the same change in strength as you would if you were 0 reps from failure, if you were at failure. So we want to be closer to that 3, 4, 5 reps from failure, because there's just it's easier to recover from that. You're going to be less sore, but there's less risk of overdoing it. And we can always take a rep out and stop a rep shy if things are starting to get a little bit sore, versus a super heavy 5 where you're going to push hard and we don't know exactly how you're going to respond. So early stage, focus on mechanical tension, sensible loads. And so if we're going to break these 3 mechanisms down again, early stage, months, week 1 to weeks 8 through 10 or 12, focusing on neuromuscular activation, metabolite accumulation with more of these kind of isolated, low load, long hold exercises where you're getting a good burn, a good pump, feeling your muscles contract well, and those are going to be done on a daily basis. As you progress a little bit further and your knee's feeling better, you start to add some load in the system, lean into mechanical tension to drive some changes in strength, still being sensible with the load. Those are going to look more like 2, 3, 4 days a week, depending on how hard you're going, so you can actually recover and let your muscles regenerate after causing some of that micro damage. Usually, I give people a combination, so we're hitting all these mechanisms, getting some really good input into these muscles on a mostly daily basis. So even at week 12, we're still doing 2, 3, 4 days a week of some of the focus on mechanical tension, sensible loads. But on the other days, people are doing some other things to focus on some of that muscle pump, focus on neuromuscular adaptation. So if someone's doing heavy step up 3 days a week, those other 2-3 days a week, they're going to be doing some of the knee extension isometrics as well, doing some hamstring isometrics as well, just to really drive in those neuromuscular changes and get some good pump going so we can drive strength changes early on. So that is the general trend throughout the process. And if you look at the roadmap, there is a template of an early stage rehab program broken up a little bit into some like the early stage, and then the midway through the early stage as well. Again, it's not something you should follow to a T, because you might have had a meniscus repair. You might have had, your surgeon might have different precautions based on your specific case and the surgery that they did. But that's the general idea. And if you look back at that after this conversation, hopefully some of the thought process makes sense as to why that is in the template for you, right? Thinking about these different mechanisms in the early phases versus the later phases of the early stage. So hopefully this felt like it was helpful, and it's a good resource for you to understand how you should be building strength in the early stages, to set yourself up for success, to lift heavier in the later stages, and really build the strength that you need to get back to sport. Because again, those strength limitations are, in my opinion, the lowest hanging fruit and the lowest bar to entry for people to safely return back to sport, and they're just not being hit. People having bad outcomes will come in at month 7, they're like, why am I not doing better? I test their strength and they're at 40% quad strength. They look like someone who's 4 months out, and that's just because they've been doing some body weight squats throughout this entire process and some clamshells. And that's not what 7-month rehab should look like. So take a look back at the roadmap and see if you feel like that applies to your situation after learning more about the early stage strength process. And hit us up in the live feed. Let us know if you have any questions about your rehab process, and just know that we're always here, right? We're here to answer questions for you on this page. And if you want some help with your specific rehab, reach out, hit the link for a consult. We'd love to help you out. And that was the whole purpose of this community, is to be a resource, but also let people know that you're not alone in this process. And if you're not happy with your PT, find someone who can help you. Find someone who works with ACLs, understands strength conditioning, and can help you get back to sport confidently. All right, guys. Well, it's been fun. It's been good talking with you all. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much with some of the science, which I can nerd out about all day. But yeah, hit us up with any questions. I hope to hear from you.